At 10 p.m. in Texas, the lights were still on, and that was the first defeat they truly felt. June 1943. The war in North Africa was over, and for the first time in years, Sergeant Carl Adler felt the strange weight of silence instead of gunfire. He and more than 1,800 men from the Africa Corps had been captured, processed, and placed aboard a ship bound for a land most of them had only read about: America. For weeks they crossed the Atlantic, confined to the belly of a Liberty ship, listening to the groan of the hull and the rhythm of engines that never seemed to tire. When the ship finally reached Norfolk, Virginia, they expected punishment, maybe humiliation. What they found instead was precision. Trains were waiting for them, real passenger cars, not boxcars. Inside were padded seats, clean linens, and soldiers who offered them water with a quiet efficiency that felt unnerving. It was as if the war had never touched this country. As the train rumbled westward through the night, Carl sat by the window with his friend Otto Reinhardt, a radio operator who used to dream of building transmitters for the Reich. Both men stared into the dark, waiting for the familiar blackness of wartime Europe, where cities lived under curfew and light was a luxury. But when the train reached the open plains of Texas, the darkness never came. Across the horizon, thousands of lights shimmered like a sea of stars brought to Earth. Farmhouses, water towers, street lamps, factories, all glowing as if the night itself had surrendered. Otto pressed his face to the glass, whispering, "No blackout? Even in wartime?" Carl didn't answer. He was too busy trying to understand how an enemy nation could afford such waste. Electricity spilling into the night without fear of bombers, without rationing, without consequence. He thought of his mother's village back home. The candles rationed, the air raid drills, the silence. And here, children might be sleeping under the soft hum of light bulbs that never went out. He took out his small diary, the same one he'd hidden from officers in Africa, and wrote slowly, "If this is defeat, then perhaps we've been fighting the wrong war." Outside, the lights grew brighter. Town after town appeared, each with its own glow, its own quiet rhythm of abundance. Even the smallest farms had power lines running like veins through the fields. In Germany, such a sight would have belonged to dreams or propaganda posters. Here, it was ordinary life. The train passed a gas station, still open past midnight, its neon sign blinking red and blue. Then a diner, filled with laughter, its windows fogged from warmth. For a moment, Carl wondered if the Americans had staged it all for show. But the ease of it, the casual way the country seemed to breathe prosperity, was too natural to fake. Otto leaned back and muttered, "If they live like this while fighting a world war, what will they be when it's over?" Carl didn't reply. He just watched the endless horizon blur by, the lights reflecting in his tired eyes like a mirror of something he could not yet name. A different kind of power, silent and unstoppable. As the train thundered deeper into the heart of Texas, he realized that his first night in America had already changed him. For the first time, defeat no longer meant shame. It meant awakening. And what awaited them beyond those endless lights would destroy everything they had ever believed about America. When the morning sun broke across the plains, the train that carried Carl Adler and Otto Reinhardt was already deep inside a country they had been told was collapsing under its own chaos. Instead, the world outside the window seemed to move with impossible order. The tracks ran straight and gleaming, lined with telegraph poles that disappeared into the horizon like a language of power. Every few miles they passed another station, another town awake before dawn, each one pulsing with the same rhythm. Machines starting, whistles blowing, people working. To the men who had lived through the shortages of the Reich, it was like watching a dream that refused to end. When the train stopped briefly at Norfolk, Virginia, Carl and Otto expected to see rubble or ration lines. What they found instead was a port that looked more like an organism than a harbor. Alive, coordinated, tireless. Massive cranes moved with electric precision, lifting containers from Liberty ships that still smelled of new paint. Dock workers in clean uniforms directed convoys of trucks as easily as soldiers in formation.
Chaos has discipline.
Otto whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. Even their chaos has discipline. Carl said nothing. He was too busy counting ships, cranes, people, each more than the last, until the numbers became meaningless. Later he would write that the single port of Norfolk moved more cargo in a day than Hamburg had in a week. And that realization, more than any weapon, made him understand how the war was truly being won. When the train pulled away, he looked back at the docks shrinking into distance and thought, this is what victory sounds like. It hums, it moves, it never stops. As the train pushed westward, the scenery changed from coastline to farmlands, from towns to endless industrial arteries. In Tennessee, they passed the aluminum plants at Alcoa, where columns of smoke rose from furnaces that burned night and day. Otto leaned toward the window, tracing the silhouettes of towers that seemed to touch the clouds. Those furnaces, they're for planes, he murmured. How many could they be building? Carl didn't know, but he guessed thousands. The guards, young Americans who spoke little German, mentioned casually that one factory in Michigan produced an entire bomber every hour. The prisoners laughed, convinced it was propaganda. Yet that night, when the train slowed outside Detroit, they saw it with their own eyes, a skyline of steel and light, stretching for miles, and beneath it, the massive body of Willow Run, a plant so vast that its own employees used bicycles to travel inside. Through the windows, they glimpsed the skeletons of bombers moving down assembly lines, wings waiting to be joined, engines polished to a mirror finish. The scene unfolded like an industrial symphony. Thousands of men and women, some in overalls, some in factory dresses, working in perfect synchronization. To Carl, it looked less like war and more like creation itself. He whispered, "They build machines the way we build faith." Otto nodded, his face lit by the glow of furnaces. "They don't just make things," he said. "They multiply them." The farther the train traveled, the more the myths unraveled. They had been told that America was lazy, decadent, soft, but the evidence outside their windows told a different story. A nation of movement, of cooperation, of quiet abundance. Every town seemed to have its own workshop, its own factory, its own rhythm of production. Even the smallest stations were crowded with freight cars full of supplies, grain, steel, trucks, coal, all flowing like blood through the veins of a continent that had never truly slept. In Germany, entire divisions fought over fuel that could move a single tank column. Here, fuel trains stretched for miles, heading west without escort. The prisoners stared as if watching another species at work. Otto noticed something else. The guards. They were relaxed, joking, eating sandwiches with meat thicker than any ration they had seen since Africa. Even their casualness felt foreign, the confidence of men who had never feared hunger. "They don't even notice their wealth," Otto muttered. "That's the difference." Carl closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it would feel like to live in such abundance and not think of it as luxury. As the train entered Kentucky, twilight returned. The same lights that had stunned them the night before began to appear again. Town after town, bright and alive, factories still running under the stars. Carl realized that in this country, production didn't stop for darkness or for war. In every window, he saw reflections of a society that had already outgrown the idea of scarcity. For the first time, he understood why their commanders in North Africa had said the Americans fought with machines, not men. Those machines were not symbols of decadence. They were extensions of will. Somewhere deep inside, the engineer in him felt admiration, even respect. But there was also fear, the quiet fear of a man realizing that his entire belief system had been built on a lie. The rhythmic clatter of the train became a metronome of revelation. Each mile they crossed pulled them further from the myths they had been raised on and closer to a truth they couldn't yet name. Otto looked out one last time before the lights of another city swallowed the dark. "If this is how their land breathes," he said softly, "what happens when we see how they live?" The question hung in the air as the train pushed south, its whistle echoing across the sleeping plains, carrying them toward the unknown. They had crossed a continent, but what they were about to see inside the camps would cross a moral frontier. When the train finally slowed beneath the morning sun, Karl Adler pressed his face against the window and saw neat rows of wooden barracks stretching toward the horizon. Signs painted in English hung over each gate. Camp Hearn, Texas. The air shimmered with heat, and somewhere beyond the fences came the hum of machines, steady, confident, alive. The prisoners expected cold rations and punishment, the gray monotony of captivity. Instead, they were met by American soldiers who looked almost embarrassed to be their guards. Each man was searched, tagged, and handed a clean uniform marked PW. The process was quiet, almost courteous. There were no shouted orders, no blows, no dogs straining at their leashes. For men raised on the fear of Allied brutality, the gentleness itself was disorienting. As Karl stepped off the train, he noticed something else: the smell of food, real food, not the thin soup of Africa or the dry bread of the front lines, but something warm and savory drifting from the camp kitchen. Inside the mess hall, prisoners were served white bread, meat, coffee, and even butter. Otto stared at his tray in disbelief. "They feed prisoners like officers," he murmured. Karl tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. The room was filled with the sound of forks against plates and the awkward silence of men unsure whether to trust what they were tasting. After breakfast, they were shown their quarters, barracks with wooden floors, windows that opened, electric lights, and even hot showers. The smell of soap lingered in the air. Karl ran his hands under the warm water for a long time, watching the steam curl around his fingers like a ghost from another life. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt clean without guilt. Outside, American guards joked quietly with one another. They carried rifles, but their posture was relaxed. The camp was surrounded not by concrete walls, but by barbed wire that gleamed in the sunlight, more a reminder than a threat. That evening, Karl and Otto sat on the steps of their barrack as the sun sank behind the pines. The air buzzed with cicadas, and from somewhere down the row came the sound of a harmonica, an American tune, slow and haunting. Otto said, "If this is how they treat prisoners, what do they do for their own?" Karl didn't answer. He was thinking about the villages back home, where civilians lived in ruins while their captors here lived with comfort. The irony burned, but it was mixed with something harder to name: respect, perhaps envy. Days passed, and the camp revealed more surprises. The infirmary was equipped with X-ray machines, surgical instruments, and shelves of medicine. When Karl cut his hand repairing a generator, an American medic cleaned the wound and gave him a shot of something new: penicillin, a drug he'd only heard rumors of in Europe. "You'll be fine," the medic said, smiling as if this were the most natural thing in the world. For Karl, it was a revelation. In Germany, such medicine was reserved for generals, not prisoners. The act itself said more than any propaganda could. It told him that strength wasn't measured by cruelty, but by confidence. In the kitchen, Otto volunteered for duty. What he found there defied belief. Walk-in refrigerators, gas ovens, electric mixers, and enough supplies to feed thousands. Every ingredient was cataloged and labeled. Every meal portioned with mathematical precision. But what struck him most was the waste. Each day, after serving the prisoners, the kitchen staff threw away untouched food according to regulation. Otto watched in silence as bread, still warm, was dumped into bins. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Today I threw away more food than my family has seen in years. I don't know if I am angry or grateful." The contradictions gnawed at them. Their training had told them that Americans were soft, materialistic, incapable of endurance. Yet here was a nation that could afford generosity even toward its enemies. The more they saw, the more the old certainties crumbled. One evening, after a storm passed, the camp's power flickered back to life. The barracks glowed softly under electric light, while the wet earth steamed outside. Carl stared at the bulb above his bunk, the small, steady hum of civilization. It wasn't grand or heroic, but it was constant, dependable. That was what the Reich had never understood. It wasn't domination that made a nation strong. It was stability, faith in the simple act of things working. Lying in the dim glow, he thought of his father, who had once told him that power came from control. But here, power seemed to come from trust. The trust that people would do their work, that machines would run, that the light would stay on. Otto turned on his side and whispered, "We're prisoners, but somehow I feel freer here than I did at home." Carl didn't reply, but he knew exactly what his friend meant. As night settled over Camp Hearn, the sound of laughter drifted from the guards' quarters. Somewhere a radio played swing music, faint but cheerful. Carl closed his eyes, hearing not defeat, but possibility. And he wondered, not for the first time, what kind of country could be this strong, this rich, this unafraid to be kind. If this was how America treated its enemies, what did it offer its own people? The answer came slowly, carried on the wind that moved across the endless American plains. By late summer 1943, Karl Adler and Otto Reinhardt had grown accustomed to life behind the wire. But even inside those fences, the United States refused to stand still. The war had pulled millions of men overseas, and the farms and factories that fed them needed hands. So the prisoners were offered work, voluntary, paid in canteen coupons or small wages. But more than that, it was a chance to see the country beyond the fences. Carl was assigned to a farm in Nebraska, while Otto, ever the tinkerer, was sent north to a food processing plant in New Jersey. Both believed they were being sent to labor, but what they encountered felt more like revelation. For Carl, the first morning on the Nebraska farm began with disbelief. The sky was so vast it made him dizzy. Tractors roared across fields that stretched to the horizon, each one guided by a single man. He had grown up in Bavaria, where 10 farmers and a team of horses worked an acre for days. Here, one American farmer commanded machines that could do it in an hour. The fields weren't just fertile, they were alive with motion. Trucks loaded with grain thundered down dirt roads, silos gleamed like silver towers, and power lines cut across the plains like veins feeding the land. The farmer, a quiet man named William, offered Carl a tin cup of coffee before sunrise and said simply, "We've got work to do." There was no hatred in his voice, no pride either, just purpose. Carl noticed the man's teenage son driving a machine larger than any tank he'd seen in Africa. The boy waved to him, grinning. That image stayed with Carl longer than any battle. A child guiding steel through soil, shaping abundance without fear. Meanwhile, Otto found himself in a world of automation he had never imagined possible. The Campbell plant near Trenton looked like a small city, its buildings connected by pipes and conveyor belts. The first time he stepped inside, the noise was overwhelming. Steam hissing, gears turning, cans clattering down endless lines. Supervisors, mostly women and older men, managed the flow of production with calm precision. Otto watched a gray-haired woman at one station control a dozen machines with the flick of a switch, all while chatting with her coworkers over a cup of coffee. It struck him with a strange kind of awe. She commands more power than a whole German factory, he thought, and no one fears her for it. In the evenings, Otto wrote letters he couldn't send, describing what he saw. A country that worked without orders, shouted, without fear of punishment. He described the workers, black, white, women, immigrants, all moving together like parts of one great engine. It wasn't equality as propaganda. It was equality as habit. They didn't talk about it, they just lived it. For Otto, who had spent years under the rhetoric of hierarchy and purity, the sight was quietly revolutionary. Across hundreds of miles, Karl experienced his own awakening. Working the land had given him time to observe the rhythm of America. There were no rallies, no speeches, no posters, just effort, reward, and a strange sense of faith that the next harvest would come. He noticed that even the smallest farms had electricity, running water, and machines that did the work of dozens. When he asked the farmer how that was possible, the man shrugged and said, "The government helped us get power back in the 30s. Everyone deserves light." Karl didn't know what to say. In his world, government help came with banners and anthems. Here it came quietly, as if progress itself were a shared right. During lunch breaks, Karl sat under the shade of a truck and listened to the farmers talk about new equipment from John Deere, about tractors that were faster, smarter, and easier to repair. "We'll get the new one after the war," one man said, wiping his hands on his overalls. "This one's still good." Even their modesty was powerful. They didn't boast about strength. They simply built it. In time, Karl and Otto began to compare notes through letters exchanged via the camp post. Otto wrote that the factory where he worked could produce more food in one day than Germany could in a month, and that the workers laughed as they worked, their energy unbroken even after 12-hour shifts. Karl replied that the fields themselves seemed to breathe with abundance, as if the soil knew no fear of scarcity. Both men realized that America's strength wasn't in its weapons, but in its confidence that life would continue. It was a machine powered not by discipline, but by belief. One evening, Karl stood with the farmer and his son, watching the sunset over the cornfields. The boy was still in his work clothes, streaked with dust, his laughter carrying across the field. Karl asked softly, "Do you ever worry about the war?" The farmer looked at him, puzzled. "Worry? The boys over there will do their job. We'll do ours." To him, there was no divide between the front line and the home front. Every plowed acre, every can of soup, every bolt tightened in a factory was part of the same victory. That realization struck Karl harder than any defeat. It wasn't that America had more machines. It was that every person, from child to worker to soldier, believed in something larger than themselves. Otto would later put it another way in his diary. "We worshipped discipline. They worship efficiency. But behind both lies a question. Who serves whom? The German serves the state. The American makes the state serve him." When autumn came, Karl returned to the camp with sunburned hands and a heart heavy with questions. He and Otto met again by the fence, trading stories in low voices. Both changed in ways they couldn't yet define. The abundance they had seen wasn't just material. It was spiritual, built on trust and faith rather than fear and control. As the evening lights flickered on around the camp, Karl said quietly, "Maybe this is what victory feels like. Even for those who lose. The words lingered in the warm air, unchallenged. The Germans had worshipped discipline, but America's secret weapon was something far more powerful: freedom. By December 1943, that truth had begun to settle deep within Karl Adler and Otto Reinhardt, like an ember that refused to go out. The work assignments were ending for winter, and the men returned to Camp Hearn under skies heavy with Texas rain. The fences were the same, but something in them had changed. They no longer looked at the guards with resentment or fear. They watched them with curiosity, even gratitude. As Christmas approached, the camp took on a strange calm. The Americans seemed busier than ever, unloading crates, organizing supplies, hanging small decorations on their own barracks. For Karl, it was the first time he had seen war coexist with celebration. In Germany, the season had become a memory buried under ration lines and air raid sirens. Here, the air smelled of pine and coffee. One evening, as he walked back from the mess hall, Karl noticed a group of soldiers carrying boxes marked church donations. Inside were small parcels, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He thought they were for the guards' families, until a young American private stopped at the gate and shouted to the interpreter, "These are for the prisoners." The interpreter hesitated, thinking he'd misheard, but the soldier just smiled and added, "Merry Christmas, fellas." Word spread quickly through the camp. At first, the men refused to believe it. No one gives gifts to enemies, not in war. Yet the next morning, the parcels were there, stacked neatly on tables inside the recreation hall, one for each man. Some contained cigarettes, others soap, a few had small tins of candy or hand-knit scarves. Karl held his parcel like something fragile, unearned. Inside, he found a note written in careful handwriting. To a soldier far from home, Merry Christmas. From the Thompson family, Hearn, Texas. He didn't know who they were, but the words struck him harder than any weapon. He read it aloud to Otto, who just nodded, eyes glistening behind his glasses. "They don't even know us," Otto whispered, "and still, they wish us well." That night, something extraordinary happened. The local Methodist choir was permitted to sing for the prisoners. As darkness fell, the sound of carols drifted over the fences, soft at first, then swelling in harmony. And then, to the prisoners' astonishment, the voices changed language. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night, the same song their mothers had sung to them as children. The men stood motionless, some with heads bowed, some gripping the wire as if it were the only thing keeping them upright. Karl felt tears he hadn't known he was holding burn his eyes. Across the fence, he saw American women singing in the glow of lanterns, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. There was no hatred there, no triumph, only peace. In that moment, the distance between captor and captive dissolved. The war, the ideology, the arrogance, all of it seemed small compared to the warmth of that sound. Otto later wrote in his journal that the true collapse of the Third Reich had begun that night, not in a battlefield, but in a song sung across a fence. In the following days, kindness kept breaking through the walls. Farmers from nearby towns sent extra produce to the camp for the prisoners' holiday meal. Children mailed hand-drawn cards addressed simply to the German soldiers. Some of the guards joined the men in building a small Christmas tree from scrap wood, decorating it with paper stars and bits of foil from ration packs. It wasn't grand, but it glowed with the same quiet strength that had filled Karl on the train months before. The power of ordinary abundance. On Christmas Eve, the prisoners were served turkey, ham, vegetables, and pie. Food so rich it almost felt indecent. Karl could barely eat. He kept thinking of the families back home in the cold, standing in line for bread. As he looked around, he saw other men struggling with the same guilt. They had come expecting punishment, and yet they were being treated with humanity they hadn't shown their own enemies. When the meal was over, Otto raised his tin cup and said softly, "To peace whenever it finds us." A few men echoed the toast. Others just sat in silence, listening to the rain tapping the roof. Outside, the guards were singing again. It wasn't about victory or vengeance. It was simply about being human. For Karl, that night became the turning point. He realized that America's strength didn't come from its factories or weapons, but from its certainty that decency was never weakness. He remembered something his father had said long ago, that mercy was a luxury of the powerful. But now he understood that mercy was the foundation of real power. The fences around him no longer felt like a prison. They felt like the boundary of an old world, one that he and Otto were slowly leaving behind. In the months that followed, rumors spread of education programs, of lectures and libraries being opened to prisoners. Some men scoffed, saying it was propaganda. But Karl and Otto had already seen enough to know better. The war might still rage overseas, but inside those camps, another war was quietly being won, a war for the soul. That night, before sleeping, Karl wrote one final line in his diary. "They conquered us without hatred. Maybe that is why they will never truly be conquered." He blew out the lamp and lay still, listening to the faint echoes of silent night fading into the dark. But when they finally returned home, they carried something far greater than freedom. They carried America itself. In the spring of 1946, the trains that had once brought thousands of German prisoners into Texas now rolled east, carrying them home to a country in ruins. For 3 years, they had lived behind fences that never felt entirely like prisons. Now, as they crossed the ocean under gray skies, the men sat quietly on deck, staring at the endless water and wondering what waited beyond it. For Karl Adler, the horizon was both a promise and a reckoning. He had left Germany as a soldier of the Reich and was returning as something he could not yet name. Otto Reinhardt sat beside him, a small notebook in his hands, its pages filled with the observations of a radio operator who had spent 3 years listening to the hum of another civilization. Neither man spoke much. They didn't have to. They both understood that the world they were sailing toward would not recognize them. When their ship docked at Bremerhaven, the port looked like the skeleton of a memory. Buildings lay shattered, cranes rusted in place, ships half sunk in the harbor. The air smelled of coal dust and loss. The men disembarked in silence, stepping onto soil that felt foreign despite being home. But inside each of them was a blueprint for something new, something learned not from ideology but from observation. Karl returned to Hamburg and found his family's workshop reduced to rubble. The machines were gone, the walls cracked, the roof open to the sky. Yet, instead of despair, he felt a strange calm. He cleared the debris and began again with salvaged tools and an idea borrowed from the farmers and factory workers he had met in America. That progress was not a miracle, but a habit. He repaired bicycles first, then tractors, then small engines. When he hired his first apprentice, he paid him fairly and gave him a voice in how the work was done. People thought he was eccentric. He didn't care. He called his shop Lichtwerk, the Light Works, because it was built on the same quiet principle he had seen glowing in the Texas night, that a nation's power begins with a single switch left on. Otto, meanwhile, became a teacher in Bremen, instructing young men in mechanics and communication systems. His classroom was small, his tools old, but his method was new. He taught his students to ask questions, to think, to trust collaboration over obedience. A machine, he told them, is only as strong as the freedom of the hands that build it. Many of his students would go on to help rebuild Germany's radio and telecommunications network, spreading ideas of openness and connection, that owed as much to his time in captivity as to any textbook. Across West Germany, thousands of former POWs carried similar stories. Men who had worked on American farms, in factories, in kitchens. Men who had seen how prosperity was shared and not hoarded. They became the quiet architects of what would later be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Not because they had been re-educated, but because they had been witnesses. They had seen a model of strength without tyranny, of productivity without cruelty. And they had learned that freedom, like light, grows brighter when it is given away. In 1985, nearly 40 years after their surrender, Carl Adler stepped off a plane in Austin, Texas. His hair was white now, his hands rough from decades of work. Otto was with him, carrying the same small notebook that had once crossed the Atlantic in his pocket. They had been invited, along with hundreds of former prisoners, to a reunion organized by the people of Herne. When they arrived at the old campgrounds, most of the barracks were gone. In their place stood trees and grass, the wind whispering through the open fields where fences had once stood. Carl closed his eyes and for a moment heard the echo of the trains, the laughter of guards, the faint music of silent night. The mayor welcomed them warmly, speaking of reconciliation and memory. Then Carl was asked to say a few words. He hesitated, looking out at the faces, Americans and Germans, old and young, former enemies and new friends. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "You didn't just win the war," he said. "You won us." The crowd was silent. Then, as if carried by the same invisible current that had once powered 1,000 lights across Texas, they rose in applause. Otto stood beside him, tears glistening in his eyes. Later that night, as they walked along the quiet streets of Austin, Carl looked up and saw the city glowing under the same kind of electric brilliance that had first stunned him 4 decades earlier. Neon signs flickered above diners, windows shimmered with warmth, cars moved through the intersections like veins of light. He turned to Otto and said, "Do you remember the night we arrived? How we thought no nation could shine like that?" Otto smiled. "Now it shines in us too." They stood there for a long moment, watching the lights dance on the wet pavement. It was not the light of conquest or pride, but of endurance, proof that the world could rebuild itself, not through domination, but through understanding. For Carl, that realization had taken a lifetime to reach. The light he had once seen as a symbol of defeat had become his compass, guiding him toward a different kind of victory. The train that had carried him into captivity had, in truth, carried him toward freedom. He died 2 years later, in his workshop in Hamburg, surrounded by machines and laughter. On his desk lay a single photograph of Camp Herne, the caption written in his own hand, "Where I first saw the future." They came to America as enemies, and left as witnesses to why freedom always wins. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a simple 0 in the comments if this story moved you, or a 1 if you want more stories, like this one. Your reactions tell us what to uncover next. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because the next chapter of history isn't just about the wars we fought. It's about the people who found humanity in the middle of them.